Hello, I'm Gemma Williams and I'm a PhD candidate in Linguistics at the University of Brighton, UK. A week or so ago, I gave my first presentation at an international linguistics conference called the VIII International Symposium on Intercultural, Cognitive and Social Pragmatics at the University of Seville. I feel it's important when you're talking about autism and when you're researching things in relation to autism to make that research and even the early stages of that research as accessible as possible to the people that it relates to. So I decided to record a version of my presentation to put online, and this is where we are now. So I'm at the very beginning of, the first year of my PhD. So really the purpose of giving my talk at the conference was to share my ideas and seek some feedback. So if anyone would like to get in touch afterwards, my contact details will be on one of the final slides. So in this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how language in autism is typically approached, then explore an alternative difference, not deficit framework borrowed from critical autism studies, and finally suggest how conceptualizing these differences as intercultural problems might shed some new or interesting light on the topic. So first of all, to clarify some terms, I'll use the term neurotypical, referring to non-autistic individuals, and autistic person or autistic individual, which is an example of identity-first language. Kenny et al. In 2016 discovered that a majority of autistic people prefer this identity-first language. It's a trend. It's not the same for everyone, but this trend isn't typically represented in research literature, so I'm trying to redress that balance and use it here. And secondly, I'm going to talk about individuals who use language to communicate the majority of the time, albeit with some idiosyncrasies, and they might often have a life pattern of misunderstandings at interpersonal levels. Previously, these individuals might have been referred to as high functioning, but there's growing recognition that functioning ability is as non-linear as the spectrum itself, and it's better understood as a constellation of traits that might vary on a day-to-day basis within an individual and certainly vary between individuals. This image is borrowed from Rebecca Burgess's blog, and there's a link you can see below. It's worth a look. So autism is characterised by impaired communication and social interaction in the diagnostic criteria in the theory books. Pragmatic deficits in autistic language have commonly been attributed to an impaired theory of mind, or as Simon Baron-Cohen termed it in 1990, mind blindness, the inability to detect or make sense of the states of others. From this perspective, the onus of failures in mutual understanding is placed within the brains and placed within the minds of the autistic individuals involved, and attributed to cognitive shortcomings. So whilst this is commonly taken for granted as a fact, it's still only a theory, and it was originally based on the observations that autistic people struggle to infer or mentalize accurately. However, the research that these theories were based on were designed originally from the perspective of autism as pathological, and measured the mentalizing only in one direction. So recent research is beginning to provide evidence of difficulties that non-autistic people have understanding autistic people too. So there is some recent research describing non-autistic people's difficulties judging autistic people's facial expressions, difficulties interpreting the behaviour of autistic people, and a reduced willingness to interact with autistic people based on unfavourable first impressions, initial judgments. So a picture is beginning to emerge that the apparently instinctive empathy of neurotypicals as not necessarily functioning when applied to the needs of autistic people. So particularly interesting about the final, the last study by Sassoon et al. Was they found that neurotypicals are biased against autistic individuals, even if the diagnosis of autism hasn't been revealed or disclosed, firstly. And secondly, most shockingly to me really, was that the bias was also seen when only static images, photographs of the autistic individuals were provided. However, the response wasn't seen when transcripts of autistic speech was provided. So there's clearly something very subtle happening, which I hope is relevant for the next part of the talk. It seems to me that interlocutors are entering into communication with some kind of sense already that their communication partner is somehow different to them. And in the case of the results that Sassoon et al. Found, having negative judgments already before the conversation begins. So the double empathy problem, based on his intuitions and anecdotal evidence from the autistic community, that the lack of understanding runs both ways. An autistic scholar called Damien Milton has proposed the double empathy problem, which he characterises as a disjuncture in reciprocity between two differently disposed social actors. According to this approach, misunderstanding is not just a consequence of autistic impairment, it's mutual, and the misunderstanding is situated in the communication between two people. So Brett Heisman and Alex Gillespie at the London School of Economics explored how the double empathy problem might be measured in terms of understanding the misunderstandings between autistic individuals and their family members. And they used a framework adopted from Lang's 1966 IPM model of intersubjective perspective taking. So hopefully you can see it on the slide there. This still is taken from a video that Brett Heisman has uploaded to YouTube, and again the title and the link is below the picture. It's a really great video and I recommend watching it if you haven't. It's a really interesting piece of research. So they found, I'm sorry that my head is in the way of the quote, they found that autistic people were able to accurately perspective take of their family members even when perspectives or opinions were not shared. So even if a family member had a negative judgment of the autistic individual that the autistic individual didn't agree with, they were still able to perspective take and know and be aware of the fact that their family member held that view. Okay, so the biases and assumptions around autism extend beyond everyday communication and into the epistemology of linguistic research too. So traditionally, features associated with autistic speech, particularly in children, such as pronoun atypicality, using the third person pronoun to refer to self, echolalia, a repetition of words or sounds out of context, and pragmatically atypical utterances were considered to be dysfunctional and belying deeper cognitive impairments. Stopponi and De Kirby, in their multi-dimensional reappraisal of language and autism, 2016, start from the position that utterances cannot be examined in isolation, and as an outcome of a speaker's cognition, and instead view speech as an interactional accomplishment where interlocutors mutually construct their turns at talk. So this is much more in view, in line with the double empathy problem, in my opinion. And they found that when taken in context, often the prototypical autistic features can have hidden communicative purposes. So third person pronoun use was seen in one analysis as the adoption of the baby talk framework used by the interlocutor. So for example, give mummy a cuddle, or leave mummy alone, she wants to drink gin. I don't know what parents say. I don't have children. I'll move on. So it's an adoption of the framework that the interlocutor's already established, rather than a confusion or avoidance of first-person pronouns, or some kind of confusion about self and not being able to differentiate self from other. And echolalia. Can I get rid of my face for you? No, face is here to stay. Sorry about that. Echolalia can be seen to involve a functional purpose and could also be interpreted as a form of perspective taking. Again, I really recommend that article, and all the references will be at the end. So in their 2010 study, Stopponi and Fusulo approach autistic language through the lens of intersubjectivity, shifting the term from one that refers to social relating based on the sharing of common ground and grasping what's in another's mind, to an interactional process of being able to go on with one another in meaning construction, and I believe they borrowed from Wittgenstein for that term. So in an analysis of transcribed conversation between a mother and her young autistic son, they found a pattern that on the surface might initially seem full of incongruent turns from the child, driven phonetically via alliteration and repetition. But when examined through this lens, it can be seen that the mother is taking the risk of going on, of following the child's lead, and in doing so, allowing language to run along the edges of meaning, allowing progressivity and intersubjectivity to blossom and mutual understanding be achieved. And they argue that mutual trust is an essential aspect of communication that has this progressivity and So, as part of his doctoral thesis, which explores enabling environments for autistic adults, Brett Heisman, again from the London School of Economics, examined communication between autistic adults, again using the lens of intersubjectivity. So he took data from recordings of autistic adults enjoying a shared task of playing a computer game, and he mapped the coherence, effect and symmetry of conversational terms within the group interaction. He found that conversations followed an unconventional pattern of intersubjectivity, namely there was a generous assumption of common ground and a low demand for coordination. So in other words, risk of going on were taken, and there was the space to take that risk of going on, in the words of Stoponi and de Kirby. So when we start to frame these communicative difficulties as being based on difference and not the impairment of one individual, my intuition tells me that an intercultural lens starts to become relevant. I can't quite put my finger yet on the correct phrasing, so I'd be interested in feedback. But in his epidemiology of representations, Dan Sperber, a linguist and anthropologist, his model of culture, of how representations spread through society, he offers a cognitive framing of culture. Shared culture, shared cultural knowledge can be seen as a shared set of cultural representations, more or less. But where individuals have greatly differing perceptual experiences, and therefore surely differing cognitive representations, or certainly differently organised cognitive representations, even if they're born into the same culture, can we really say that they're sharing exactly the same set of representations? So autistic individuals have great perceptual differences, and therefore arguably different points of salience. When you apply relevance theory lens to communication, utterances are based on the assumption of optimal relevance. Perhaps what's being taken for granted as mutually manifest actually isn't. So I'm not suggesting that there's a single autistic culture. The perceptual atypicalities are highly idiosyncratic and, differ wildly and brilliantly. But I wonder if autistic individuals inhabit a space that is at the edge of the culture that they're brought into. So from this position, it seems useful to look at other intercultural or cross-dispositional communication. English is a lingua franca. ELF is any use of English among speakers of different first languages for whom English is the communicative medium of choice and often the only option. So ELF is just one example of intercultural communication, but it is unique on account of its vast spread around the world, largely through globalization. Key features of English as a lingua franca, I feel, are that it's transcultural. ELF users demonstrate high levels of intercultural communicative competence, and this goes far beyond simply awareness of nation culture differences. They effectively move between their known worlds and the worlds of encountered difference, and co-construct what Young and Suchdev call a relativizing C3, a third culture. So they co-create a new and shared cultural space. Comity. Patricia Pullen describes the consensual and cooperative nature of ELF and refers to this as comity. And Firth also observed the working consensus arrived at that's outside of predefined linguistic norms and perhaps cultural norms. So I feel that there's an attitude of receptivity that is prevalent amongst ELF speakers, and this is expressed in a willingness to make extra efforts, coming back to relevance theory, to understand and to be understood, their preferences, intelligibility over accuracy, and drives accommodation. Accommodation in ELF uses converging towards a central form and adjusting one's receptive tolerance to different forms. And you see this across lexis, syntax, phonology, pragmatics, everywhere. So my closing thoughts, in ELF use, cultural and arguably, by extension, conceptual and cognitive differences are overcome through the extra efforts made in the form of accommodation. And ELF is typified by a reduced mutual cognitive environment in relevance theoretic terms. As cultural differences broaden, there is less that is mutually manifest. In cross-neurotypical and autistic communication, could the difficulties seen in cross-neurotypical autistic communication be considered a failure of reciprocal accommodation and a lack of willingness to talk at the edge of meaning? So my closing questions that I think arise from this kind of line of thinking, and I'd like to build my research around. How does the use of a difference not deficit lens change our analyses of autistic language use? Is there anything we can learn from ELF talk that might benefit our understanding of autistic language use, or using an intercultural lens, viewing the communication from an intercultural perspective? And are there any common meta-pragmatic strategies between ELF users and competent autistic speakers? Here's the first slide of my references. And the second slide, again, I'm sorry my head's in the way, I don't know how to get rid of it. So, as I said at the beginning, this was my first conference presentation. This is also my first attempt to make a video. It's quite technical, as it was written for a linguistics conference. I'm aware of that, and that might not be completely accessible to everyone. So I'll continue thinking about how to do a better job of making the research that I do more widely accessible. And if you're coming to this from an interest in linguistics, there could be more detail. I've tried to pare it down. Okay, well, thank you very much, and keep on keeping on. Goodbye.